The Diary of Dr. X, Episode 8, The Inefficiencies of Mechanization. I think I've mentioned the difference between economic and ecological understandings of efficiency in a previous episode, if I'm not mistaken. Economics defines efficiency in terms of saving time and labor, and therefore money. This maximizes profits by minimizing jobs, which are largely replaced by machinery. Ecology defines efficiency in terms of saving energy and materials, as I've mentioned. If you can do the same job using less energy and materials, or with less waste in the process, you are doing it more efficiently. What I haven't mentioned is that this also means creating more jobs, which I may return to in a future episode. You see, centralization and mechanization may be efficient at eliminating jobs and maximizing profits, but in my experience, they do so at the expense of incredible waste, at least in the food production industry. This brings me back to the 2 years in hell I spent working at as a production worker or a baker's helper at a local bread plant. The name is a joke, really, baker's helper that is, as only 3 people in the whole plant actually did anything resembling baking, namely the scaler, the mixer, and the oven operator. The rest were part of the machinery, as I mentioned. The scaler mixed the dry ingredients, the mixer added the wet ingredients, such as liquid sugar and canola oil, to create the dough, and the oven operator, operated the oven, so he had something to do with baking also. Everyone else just moved product from one place to another in the process, except for the divider operator, but he was just a machine operator too, never touched the dough. You see, the divider cut and rolled the doughs into appropriate shapes, dropped them into pans, which the crew loaded in at one end and loaded onto racks at the other. Machinery was doing the baker's job, not the operator. After that, the racks got pushed into the proofer, as I mentioned. Basically, it was a sauna, which accelerated the rise of the dough for about an hour. There was room in there for 28 racks of about 200 loaves, give or take. Then it was on to the oven, which loaded about 50 loaves every 2 minutes. Then out and up to the cooling conveyor near the ceiling for about half an hour to an hour, and down to the wrappers, which bagged the products and out to shipping. I'm sure you can see the efficiencies from an economic perspective of this whole process. The machinery did most of the work. Other than the 4 operators, there were only 2 to 3 other people at the divider, depending whether it was bread or buns. The loader, the pan stacker when they came out of the oven, 4 people at the wrappers, as well as 1 or 2 people on relief, giving people their coffee breaks and lunches. I used to love it when I got that job. Yet these 13 to 15 people could produce 1,500 loaves of bread per hour, minus the 2-minute breaks between varieties. Even given the 3 people working in shipping and supervisory staff, that's nearly 100 loaves per person per hour. I'm sure you can also see how many jobs all that machinery displaces if you consider for a moment how many people it would take to do the same job if they were doing everything by hand and using ecologically appropriate or human-scaled technology rather than capitalist machinery, as my buddy E.F. Schumacher called it. The whole process was also incredibly wasteful. Indeed, waste was an expectation of the production process, believe it or not. The company's target was to keep waste below 4%. And what is 4% of 1,500 loaves per hour? 60 loaves per hour of waste as an acceptable goal. Now, sometimes we actually manage to accomplish that. But as you can imagine, if there was any mechanical problems anywhere down the line, and especially at the oven or the cooling conveyor nearest the end, then that acceptable level of waste could skyrocket in a big hurry. Imagine the oven breaking down for half an hour, for example. The proofer holds 25 racks of 200 loaves, or 5,600 loaves. They can only be in there for an hour, or they rise too much and don't meet specifications and can't be baked. They start to flow over the sides of the pans and get crusty on top. Well, this didn't happen every day, but it was not an uncommon occurrence over 2 years. Once the oven broke down for 2 weeks and we were all out of work, basically. And what do you do when the oven breaks down? Well, you try to recycle as much of that dough as possible. 5,600 loaves now. This means everyone takes their gloves off to remove the dough from the pans and throw it into 5-gallon buckets. Of course, when you pick up the pans, your hands get covered with the residual oil and grit from the oven, since the pans never get washed, as I mentioned, and this goes into the bucket too, along with the dough. At least a percentage of this actually gets mixed back into the fresh doughs as they come through when production gets back up and running, and the rest goes into the garbage. Interestingly, there were even guidelines on how much white bread could be mixed with 60 or 100% whole wheat doughs and vice versa within acceptable parameters. All of which means that the ingredients labels printed on the product were wildly inaccurate after an incident such as this, as you can imagine. And needless to say, those of us who worked there would warn family and friends not to buy our bread for a few days after a breakdown such as this. Because machinery is imperfect, much waste was also built into the system. Doughs sometimes didn't land in the pan correctly, leading to misshapen product, which got tossed. Or they fell out of the pan and got tossed. Or pieces of dough flew off the mixer as it dumped a half-done dough into the troll, which is what we called the great big bathtub, basically, which was used to transport the dough to the divider. It sometimes fell out of the pan on the exit conveyor out of the oven also, or got crushed by the depanner, which used suction to vacuum the bread off the pans. Any little imperfection in the operation of the ideal system, whether caused by human error or mechanical, led to waste. In fact, it was unavoidable, as though it were designed into the system. The seeder was the best example of such designed waste. This little contraption sat on top of the loading conveyor to the oven. This is where the bread doughs went up when you loaded them on, one after another, just about like that. It was mostly used for sesame top breads and buns. It was turned off and on by a sensor, which detected when pans were present under it, but it was programmed in such a way to turn on the seeds just before the pan arrived and turn it off just after the pan left, to make sure nothing was missed. I never measured the exact amounts, but this, combined with the fact that a large percentage of the typical pan does not contain any dough, basically meant that at least half of the seeds applied ended up on the floor every time the seeder was used. And this was daily. To say nothing of how many seeds fell off the bread when it got loaded into the oven or got taken off of the pans, or as it rode around the cooling conveyor up in the ceiling. I'd bet maybe 5 to 10% of the sesame seeds applied to these buns ever actually ended up in the package, and then a good percentage of those fell off in the package before you could eat them, because of course when you buy sesame top buns, you throw in a package with a whole bunch of sesame seeds in the bottom, right? Not very efficient. It was much the same with the raisin bread. We put about 4 to 6 20-pound boxes of raisins in each dough, depending on its size, and when it was spun out of the mixer into the troll, there were raisins flying everywhere. I'd estimate that at least 10 to 20% ended up on the floor daily as part of the usual routine. That's why we always did raisin breads last, because you had to clean up afterwards. And what did they do with all this cumulative waste that this incredibly efficient process was producing? There was an Oriental pig farmer and his wife who came to pick it up daily in a 3-ton farm truck so they could feed it to their pigs. Bloody expensive pig feed from the perspective of ecological efficiency, but at least it wasn't thrown in the trash. I got to know those pig farmers pretty well too. You see, I was often one of the people who shovel it all up into 20-gallon barrels and wheeled them back to the garbage room, one after the other at the end of the shift. They were always glad to see me. Heck, on a good day, they got 2 trucks full, sometimes 3. So capitalist efficiency has its benefactors. So far, I forgot to ask them what they paid for its garbage. Cheers.